Welcome, students, teachers, alum, and the generally curious to another edition of the Constitution. What Constitution? With the Friends of Publius. From now on, I feel we must approach every subject dealing with American constitutional democracy with a sense of irony. In this episode, we will be talking about the framers' fear of factional tyranny and how they attempted to control factions through the structure of government. Before we get to that discussion on factions and the breakdown of American constitutional government, we have a few items of interest. First, we hold these truths to be self-evident that we have chosen to be governed by the four horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. Number 47 has claimed numerous times that he is king, a patrimonialist who believes that if he is serving the country, he does not violate the law, and whose faith advisor has stated to say no to Trump is to say no to God. For those of you who wondered what it would feel like to slide into authoritarian tyranny, guess what? We are there. The fun and funny part of this is that the occupant of the White House has created a shadow monarch in Elon Musk who does most of the work, while number 47 has spent most of his time playing golf or hosting parties at his various properties. 60% by multiple sources of his time has been playing golf or hosting parties. Our second point of interest here is that in a recent episode, the FOPs were asked to talk about the influence and contribution of Lafayette. And it came to me that we forgot to mention that a significant legacy of the Frenchman is Lafayette Park, right next to the White House, where numerous and significant protests have occurred, such as the suffragettes in 1917 and Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. So let your Unit 6 classmates know that the FOPs have now filled their cup with substance on Marquis de Lafayette. Professor Moore, I know, is happy about that. Finally, let's find out what our FOPs feel about this day in history, 1868, when the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson began. Is this a need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know, Professor Williams?
Oh, I'm gonna go with
I like starting with you.
I know you gotta, I'm gonna go with nice to know. I'm gonna go with nice to know because I think it shows the divisions that were occurring in the United States right during Reconstruction. It's not a need to know because there's other divisions, there's other fights that are gonna happen, other things I think are more important. But I definitely think it's nice to know on impeachment that happened but wasn't quite successful. That should resonate with current times.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, must,
Ooh,
quintuple must know. It's the first impeachment. It shows, to Mike's point, it shows the divisions, the bitter divisions. It also, I think, is important to reaffirm, in my opinion, that failed impeachment really did reaffirm what the anti-federals said all along about the impeachment clause, that it wouldn't be used effectively. So I think at the time it really does bring out the divisions within the political parties and within Congress. So I'd say it's kind of how we judge. When way back in the day when I was in the classroom, I always referenced it when we got to Nixon. And I would presume teachers now, when they're teaching the Trump impeachments, will harken back. Now we have four to think about rather than just two when I was in the classroom. So yeah, I'd say it's a must know.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Need to know. Absolutely. What Tim said is the first impeachment. And by the way, Andrew Johnson was impeached, right? He was impeached. Let's make sure. I mean, I drive this home with my students, because the House votes charges, the trial is held in the Senate. Being impeached does not mean to be removed from office. It simply means to be charged, to accuse, or indicted. And he was charged. By the way, the radical Republicans already had a list of like 15 charges. They were just waiting for Johnson to screw up. And so when he violates the Tenure of Office Act, we just happen to have this in our drawer, this list of all these charges to bring up, and the fact that he stays in office by one vote. I think partially too, it's important in terms of teaching Reconstruction because the last few months of his administration Johnson's was spent dealing with this trial where it forces him out of the way. The radical Republicans in Congress, as they're moving forward with what they're trying to accomplish during Reconstruction, which ultimately will be the 14th Amendment. So I think it's definitely a must know, need to know.
Yeah, I'm probably trapped somewhere between need and nice. I appreciate Mr. Moore bringing up what he sees as a possible failure of the system, and I think that's an interesting debate in itself because I know some people, and I don't remember the member of the Senate who ultimately votes not guilty, but it's considered a profile in courage by some. So is it an example of a profile in courage and justice in our political system, or is it an example of the failure of the impeachment process to effectively limit the power of the president? So, for students and teachers, you get to have that discussion on your own. So, thank you, Fops, for your insights on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So, let's now turn to our learned discussion on factions by starting with our band member who, when he was in high school, led his county in passing yards as the quarterback of the football team, as well as yards lost due to sacks by the opposing team. So Dr. James Michael Williams, football quarterback extraordinaire. Mike, for years there has been some confusion, debate over what exactly is a faction. So, how would you define, providing maybe some contemporary historical illustrations of what a faction is?
Yeah, no, I think obviously the place to start is by to look in what Madison says in Federalist 10, right? And I think sometimes I know my students tend to rush through what he says and not get to the very end part. So, it's important that a faction is a group of citizens. It can be a majority or minority of citizens who have some common interest, right? But then the last part of what Madison says in that interest is adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So that's where a lot of these questions become, and it depends, or how do you define adverse to the rights of or the common interests? So for example, David, when you were just talking about President Trump and how he has claimed and his advocates have claimed that he is serving the country, like he's doing what's good for the common good, right? Well, if that's your point of view, then you would see the MAGA Republicans, which some of us might define as a faction within the Republican Party. If you see that what he's doing is for the aggregate good, then you might not say it's a faction. You might, that definition may fall off. So that's how I would work with the definition. It doesn't lead to a great yes or no answer for a multiple choice test, but it leads to students to think about what Madison and what we may mean by adverse to the rights of, or what the common aggregate interest of the community is.
Well, you brought up a couple of things there I want to follow up on. One, because you said adverse to is it the interest of others or to the kind of the general good?
It says adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community.
Okay, so let's is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Martin Luther King, is that a faction?
Yeah, in the literature on this, I found different opinions. So I found some that said, no, it's not a faction, because what the Southern Leadership Conference was trying to do was advocate for universal democratic rules and norms for all citizens. So therefore, it was not advocating an interest that was at the adverse to the rights of or against the community interest. Other places in the literature, you find folks who say, no, 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 no. What he was advocating for is to the adverse interests. I, as a business owner, have an interest to maybe just serve my coffee and pancakes to just white citizens, and as a property owner, I should have that. And what Martin Luther King is advocating partly is to integrate the lunch counter. So I don't have a good. There's no good yes or no. I think most would kind of lend to say, because I think most folks talking about this focus on it's a group of people with a passion or an interest. And if you just stop there, then you would say, well, of course it's a faction because he has a particular interest in or goal that he's trying to get to. But if we flush out the definition and go for the whole thing, then it gets a little more complicated.
I mean,
So,
I can't help but think context is king here as well, because if no pun intended, I think by framing by framing it within the civil rights movement, it's easy to make it a faction. If you frame it, as Mike said, as a larger, much more broad agenda than just civil rights for African Americans, then I think the categorization might change. But I think because seems to me, because it's been placed within a civil rights group agenda, it's easy to see it as a faction.
So go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was just going to say, I always say factionalism is in the eyes of the beholder. And I think that's the same thing Tim was saying in terms of context, right? So it's like, is a Klan a faction? Is the Ku Klux Klan a faction? And,
Well, clearly, yes. I don't think that one's subject to debate because again, if we use Mike's, the literal definition or the explanation in Federalist 10, it's clearly a faction.
Well, then you could say that the same thing is true about the SLC.
But how are they adverse to the interests of others?
Because
or the rights of others. I'm sorry, the rights of others, not interests, the rights.
Well, because if I'm a white person in the South and I'm a member of some type of citizens league, I see Dr. King coming in as an outsider, stirring up trouble, and and Tim said it's context; it's in the eyes of the beholder. So people, his definition of talking about President Trump. So if you see something as being adverse to your common good, then you're going to see it as a faction. If you see it supporting what you believe, I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying what you believe to be the common good. Then they're not. They're an interest group. They're not necessarily a faction.
So if a group has an opposition, there's somebody opposed to what it advocates, it therefore ipso facto is a faction.
Not necessarily.
No, I think there's a scale. I can't help but think there's a scale involved here. Like, for example, parties. My way of thinking about this is parties are not factions; they have factions within them. In other words, when you look at back in the day when we had party platforms, you would look at those planks, and those planks within a party platform seem to be, throwing a bone to various factions within the party. So the party operates at a much larger scale, whereas factions are much more singular in interest, and therefore more limited in scope. So I think the party platform and the back in the day might be a nice way to think about factions within parties. And I got to get this in. Jonathan Swift has this great quote. Political parties are the madness of many for the gains of the few. Factions are the madness of a few for the gains of none.
That's good.
I mean, to that issue of scale, like how broad do parties aspire
Yeah.
to influence and act versus actions?
Let me just add to what Tim said, because the key here is to start with what is the aggregate interest, right? Do we have a consensus on that? So if we think about, is it in the aggregate, like in terms of the nation, do we think it's a good thing that people participate in politics? Well, okay. I think not everyone's going to agree with that, but we might say, okay, yeah, in a republic, in a small d Democrat, republic, yes. Is it a good thing that voters have information before they go participate? Yeah, probably, right? And one of the roles of parties, like as it has developed in the political science literatures, those are two functions that parties play. It's really not about faction. They're supposed to be mobilizing voters and informing voters to make choices. And then to Tim's point, I think it's absolutely right that within those parties themselves, you have factions that are fighting it out over like what is the platform going to be or what is the goals once you get power. But you can look at the goal, the role of parties is twofold, right? One is playing this role of getting people informed and mobilizing. The other is getting power and then instituting an idea, which is going to be the result of a factional fight where one part comes out the winner.
So within the field of academia, Tim, there is, I guess some debate regarding the importance of Washington's farewell address, which I think most of us know is written by both a little bit of James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. But I'm wondering, is this quote that the students have to deal with in the question, it seems to me that Washington is referring to the initial rise of parties, that parties are factions. All right. Is that part of the importance of his farewell address?
Yes, it is. And by the way, there's academic fights about Washington's relevance in general, not just his farewell address. Um,
Ouch.
well, uh,
Is he more significant than Lafayette?
uh, yes. And you can find resources to research about Washington.
Okay, my bad, my bad. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I forgot the question now.
Well, again, the significance of the address, but
Yeah,
also
okay.
within this discussion of fact, it seems to me the quote is arguing that he is referring to the emerging parties
Yeah.
of the time, and therefore
Um,
parties are factions.
well, I do happen to think we would be well served to do like the Senate and the House still do to this very day. On his birthday, they read the full farewell address. And that's been the case since I think the 1880s. Because and I reread it this weekend as well, and I caught, it'd been about a couple of years since I'd read it. And I think it's very significant because there's a very for several reasons. Number one, like the first paragraph, he says, "I'm not going to run again," and that was significant. It set the two-term presidency trend, and which was later constitutionalized. But the message is very simple: unity. Parties are a problem, and going forward, there's a need for morality in our governance. And he addresses the foreign policy piece. I would say it's more important to think about the farewell address in terms of domestic. And to your point, David, he is very concerned about factions and party. Now, it's unclear to me. I'm going to give you a lot of my thinking has been colored by first couple chapters of a book by Richard Hofstadter, The Idea of Political Party. And at the time, he makes the argument there are three views of party. Hamilton represents one view, Madison represents another view, and Jefferson represents another view of party. And they all have varying degrees of whether they like them or not. Washington is in the camp of, and they've been influenced by British politicians. Washington is influenced by Bolingbroke, where there should be no parties. And so a lot of his vitriol in his farewell address is assuming there should be no parties because he says in the address, in a representative system, we don't need parties because the structures is where all the rattle and hum will occur in various interests. The institutions will address those varying interests. Now, he does say the parties are absolutely essential in a monarchical system. For some reason, he makes that distinction that you need parties when you have a monarchy, but you don't need them when you have a representative government. So that was that was interesting point he was making, but he represents a visceral response to parties, but he's one view of parties, and his colleagues will take, and oddly enough, his cabinet members will take differing views as we get through the 1790s. So I say this, it is worth reading the address. There's a lot in there that really does resonate, not just in our time, but other times. And I think there's a little disingenuous, I think, because he doesn't want opposition. So for him, the Democratic and his first foray into anger is these democratic societies that were formed in the 90s, where the Jeffersonians were getting together. There were 35, 36 of these around the country, and they were raising holy hell with Federalist policy, starting with Hamilton's Report on Manufacturers, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Neutrality Declaration. So he sees these, he called them self-created. They operated outside the government structures. He saw them as really problematic and should not exist.
Well, you said that one of the things about this address is he advocates morality in government. Is that a Christian morality or is that a sense of civic virtue which is
Yeah.
tied to faction?
It's a great question, and I think a lot of my fellow evangelicals read it as Christian. I look at it, and I mean, you read a lot of Washington's writing when he talks about religion, and he uses the most unbelievably vague terms about the creator of the universe, the author of all good things. I mean, there's all kinds of creative ways that he describes this deity. Um, so I would say it's more because, and he also talks about the morality of credit, the immorality of runaway credit, which is interesting. Uh, so I think you got to be careful if you see that section of the address in interpreted to mean Christian morality. Now, I don't know that I believe that he wouldn't oppose that at all, because there's many Christian principles that justice and fairness and those kinds of things that he would articulate, but he couches them within a constitutional framework, constitutional morality in a way.
Chris?
Well, I was just thinking, listening to your description and knowing what I know of Washington, it sounds to me that these other pockets of democracy, little democratic clubs that spring up,
Yeah.
he just doesn't like having his authority challenged. That was the same way it was true when he was a general, and I think it's true when he becomes he's used to being an elite guy, and he doesn't necessarily want to have people kind of pushing back on it. And by the way, I don't think Washington ever did actually belong to a church, did he?
No.
Yeah,
No.
I didn't think so.
No.
So yeah, most of his language is very broad when he's talking about religion
I
or God.
I take a little more generous view to Washington on didn't like to be challenged, your thesis there, Chris, because his experience in the revolution is that self-interest in the states wreaked havoc on the national military. So I think he has some cred other than he just didn't. I mean, and you are right, he didn't like to be challenged. That's a valid point. But I would say it's a little more textured than that because of experience.
Well, certainly as a general, you don't, I mean, in the military sense, you follow orders. You got two choices, right? You can resign your commission, you can leave, you can get arrested, you can get shot, or you follow orders. And so I think he was getting upset as a general with these guys who were voting whether or not they're going to stay. And he considered local militias useful and useless at the same time. So
Yeah.
that from the military standpoint, I understand. But I think about like when he goes down to the Senate for advice and consent on treaties, and he pulls out his maps and he's like, "I'm never going back there again."
Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, I just want to add to this discussion to remind the students that we mentioned this in previous episode. Federalist 10 was not the most important Federalist paper in the debate over ratification of the Constitution. And it definitely, I think it's fair to say, Tim and Chris, correct me, that Washington had Madison's academic arguments about factions going in his head as he served as president. I mean, I think to Tim and Chris's point, I mean, for me, I think of Washington as he realizes how perilous the union is. He's really focused on our security and getting our economy up and running so that we will not be taken over by Britain or by France or by Spain. So I think he's coming at it from just a pragmatic point of view. He doesn't like to see these divisions happening within his administration or within the Congress because he sees it as that's going to be a sign of weakness to others. So I just want to make sure the students understand he's not like reading Federalist 10 at night and thinking through like how factions are forming. That's not what's going on at all.
Yeah, nobody's reading Federalist 10 at night, I'll tell you that.
Well,
or if they do, they'll go to sleep real quick.
Yeah, I assume that's contextual because I read it at night, so I can't believe I'm alone there, kind of thing. So, Professor Kavanaugh, the question asks whether Washington's fears about factions have become a reality in American politics today. I would argue that Washington's fears came true very early on in our political history, i.e., during the antebellum period, post-Civil War, the Gilded Age. Do you agree with that this problem in which the kids are asked, how's that problem manifests itself contemporarily, has been with us since day one?
Oh, yeah, because again, I did not stay up late at night reading Fed 10, but I've looked at it a couple times, and I do believe Madison says
I call BS. I don't believe that.
that I've read it a couple times, or that it was late at night.
That you didn't read it at night. I think you
Okay.
did. I'm pretty sure you
Okay.
had your copy of the Federalist Papers underneath your pillow at night. So
Yeah, I'm waiting for the Federalist Ferry to come visit me. But anyway, um,
It'll be a demon. You should want the anti-federalist fairy to come visit you.
well, I think it probably looked like Lafayette when he shows up. But anyway, um, I think that Madison says that, gosh, now I've lost my train of thought, just
I'm
got
sorry.
derailed. That's okay. No, the idea of Federalist 10 is that, gosh dang it, that is baked into the cake. Factionalism is baked into our DNA as humans. It's inevitable, right? And so, yes, David, that's a forgetful way of saying yes. I agree with you because and to Mike's point, he already sees it playing out in his cabinet, right, between his Secretary of State and his de facto his Elon Musk. We'll call him Alexander Hamilton. He already sees that playing out between those guys, and so I think he's a little fearful of that as well. So, and not sure which part of this that Hamilton wrote or that Madison wrote, or is this Hamilton throwing shots across the bow, or is this Madison throwing shots across the bow? You know, in terms of warning about this.
Yeah,
But
I think he's channeling Hamilton more so than Madison because Madison, being a realist, realized there would be factions
oh
in
yeah,
there.
yeah.
So the address itself, back to the address, he doesn't want those things to exist. So he's channeling Bolingbroke, not David Hume, where Madison is channeling David Hume. They're inevitable and we can control them. So I don't think he's channeling Madison at all. He's channeling Hamilton through.
The only way I would push back on this question, David, I would agree with you. The factions are inevitable, and we see that in the first administration. We see that in the next administration. Absolutely, we see it. But and there's one word here that caught my eye, and that is certainly we have politicians that were cunning. We have politicians that were ambitious, but the idea of unprincipled. Uh, with the exception perhaps of Aaron Burr, I would say these guys did have principles. Now they may have disagreed with each other, but I think they were principled men, and we know that they did believe in virtue. But we also know they're practical politicians. I mean, there's no more practical politician than Thomas Jefferson, right, or Alexander Hamilton. But I think that these guys, and maybe this is me just being Pollyanna, maybe wanting to put the dead white guys on a pedestal they don't need to belong on, but I do think that they were principled. Where as we move forward and party politics really starts to take a grip, I think you start to see the desire for power at whatever cost, and then principles perhaps fly out the window. So that's my one saying maybe they had cunning and ambitious, but those guys had principles. I don't know. You guys could
you
disagree.
guys have a response to Chris Pollyanna here because I couldn't disagree with him more, especially when I look, I'm sorry. And I have a portrait of Jefferson right behind me, given to me by students in the class, I think, of 1989 or whatever. But come on, the kind of stuff he did as vice president, that's principles. The election of 1800, him and Adams, those are principles. I'm just wondering, Tim and Mike,
You're
where
channeling
are you
Joe
at on
Ellis
this?
there, beating up Jefferson, and there are some soft spots there, but again, I couch it within this Hofstadter's framework. Washington is stuck with believing we don't need parties and we should not have parties. Madison says we have to have parties and we can control them. And Jefferson, by the time we get to Jefferson in power, he says parties are absolutely essential because they are opposition and we need opposition. So I think it depends where you are within, the Bolingbroke, Hume, and Burke. Actually, Jefferson is channeling the Burke theory of opposition, the role for parties.
And yeah, and I think well, correct me on this if I'm off, but I think what you just laid out, Tim, if you look at the growth of parties, where we can definitely say, yeah, we have this, like think about the Jacksonian era, and Jackson is definitely leaning into Jefferson's idea of that vision of political parties. And that forms kind of the modern structure that we have today for the political parties. Before that, And Jackson represents, right, the next generation of Americans, right, to sort of take the helm. So I think there's something to what you laid out from Hofstadter and how it then continues.
Yeah, and Jackson embraces the self-created society. I mean, Washington hated those Democratic clubs. He really believed that all of this could take place within the constitutional structure. We didn't need independent groups screaming and hollering. Well, that is fully embraced by the Jacksonian Democrats that you were in back in the old days. That was called the out-of-door political activities versus indoors, the official government structures.
And Chris, I mean, again, I'm glad you brought up that section of the quote there. And I think we'd all agree. I just don't want students to get locked in to that question as somehow this is just a contemporary issue.
Right.
That
I'm
that
with you.
that I would believe that you and I, if we were judging, we might want to go back in time and talk about, and as you were talking, I'm thinking, is there any period in American history in which Washington's concerns are not alive and I'm not going to say well, but just something that to be aware of there. So I think we'd all agree that students just need to be aware that this issue that he talks about is very prescient at his time, and it continues on throughout our history here. And I think it is a good debate about the notion of unprincipled. I might disagree with you on that, but I'm glad you pointed that
I
out.
I was trying to find one shred, one thing I could maybe a tiny little hook on which to hang a tiny little hat. So
That's so optimistic and sunshiny of you. That's so unlike you.
well, maybe my near death experience has got me turned around a little bit. I don't
Oh, I thought it was the promise of the Chicago Cubs this coming baseball season has gotten you
know.
optimistic and yeah, kind of stuff there. So, Professor Williams, many critics, and we're going to get into Federalist 10 here. Many critics of Federalist 10 argue that our system failed, all right, to control the negative impact of factions due to the fact that the structure of government was not strong enough to limit factional power. Do you agree first with the premise that our system has failed to control factions? And secondly, do you agree with the charge that the structure of government was the root of that failure?
Yeah, I'm gonna be kind of like it's a great question, and I'm gonna be kind of it depends. Tim's
That's
kind
our motto.
yeah, but I wanted
Motto.
He's like a young Tim Moore.
let me ease into this question by reminding the students that what okay, I think Madison's concerns in Federals 10 are different than the concerns we should have today, and I think that the assumptions he had about which factions we should be worried about are not the factions we should be worried about today. So I think we'll get to that. But I want to remind the students that Madison, when he what is he making an argument about? The anti-federalists are saying we can't have a republic in a place so big. And what's going to happen to our local interest? And what if like a majority of you New Englanders, like whatever, right? What if the South gets left behind? So he makes this argument like, look, we have an option here. We can't get rid of the cause of faction because that would be getting rid of liberty. So if you're worried about majority tyranny, we're going to set up a system where it's going to be decentralized, where there's going to be a separation of powers. It's going to make it really, really hard for any one majority to ever get power long enough to tyrannize a minority. And you set up the system around that premise, right? Well, I think Madison also, as a practical politician, wants things to get done. So what's he assuming is gonna happen as these diverse interests get together in separation of powers? To Chris's point, I don't know if it's about principles, but it's definitely about compromise. I mean, it's definitely about like, okay, you have to work together, and you may not get everything you want all the time, but you get some of what you want this time, some of what you want next time, and that works into how this structure is supposed to work. Um, that is not how the structure is working today. I don't tend to think it's just because of the structure. I mean, the structure was set up to make it more difficult to get things done. I think to get policies done. We did not adopt a parliamentary system with basically one functional house with a two-party system. That's how you get things done. So I think that the structure has something to do with it. I would look to like the role of media, and not just beginning now, but I would say I'm reading this book, What Has God Wrought, about 1815, 1814. And the premise of the book is like that period is this huge communication transportation revolution. And you really we are going through a similar revolution today with technology that I think with the media, with ideological sorting, these are things that are making the structure harder to contain, the factions that Madison's talking about. I don't think it's just the structure though. I think it has worked at different times. It hasn't worked at others. So I'll leave it there for now.
Well, it seems to me that you're saying that it'd be somewhat unfair to criticize Madison and his theories, I guess, if you want to say, in Federalist 10, because there was no way that they could anticipate the kind of changes that would occur 100 years. As
Sure.
we look at the commercial and transportation and communication revolution in the late 19th century there. I did find it curious that you said he wasn't addressing the issues that we face today.
Yeah.
Isn't the latent cause of faction or the key cause the concentration of money?
Well, no,
Isn't
see,
that one of his arguments, gentlemen?
Well, religion too, religion and money.
I'll let someone else take it and then I'll come back around.
Well, Fed 10 absolutely talks about the first role of government is to protect the different faculties and men for acquiring property. So he's defending a class system. And I would actually push back and say the structure absolutely has helped get us where we are. The structure of our Constitution has helped get us where we are. When we have a first past the post, a winner take all system, you're going to end up with inevitably two parties. And when two parties now that, and I'm jumping forward here, and two parties now where at least one of them, there are no factions within that party because there's purity within the party, right? So the factions within parties that Tim alluded to that used to take place, where you had these different planks in the platform and you're trying to, appease the different groups within. You're trying to get this big tent, right? Now we have one party that has no factions within that party, or nobody with the courage in that party to speak up and challenge that. So I'm going to say it's the structural issue as well that has helped get us into this issue. I'm channeling my inner Sandy Levinson here.
Mike?
Well, I would just, it's not in the Constitution that we have first past the post. I mean, it kind of depends on how broadly we want to define the constitutional structure. That's left up to the states. States that are a lot of different ways, and then it kind of like congealed into that. But I do take your larger point. My point about that Madison's assumptions don't apply today is Madison was worried about majority tyranny. And I think what we're witnessing now is minority tyranny. And this has been laid out by Levitt and Zablowski's. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
We're seeing it happen right now.
But doesn't that then feed into what Chris just said, that the structure allows the tyranny of the minority?
But I think it's unfair. Madison was addressing a different question. He was thinking, how do we set up a system to not have majority tyranny? Because he couldn't foresee how would the minority ever tyrannize the majority in a small R republic. So I see him being concerned about a different question or a different problem of factions. Then very quickly it became apparent that those with wealth were going to start dominating government, I guess. I mean, that's my reading of Federalist 10 and what was in Madison's head. Tim and Chris.
So, did you say how the majority would ever tyrannize the minority? Is that what you said, Mike?
So, I'm sorry, say it again, Chris.
How the minority would tyrannize the majority.
Oh, how the minority would tyrannize the majority. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Professor Moore, we've talked already a little bit about parties. I am wondering to what extent, if anything, parties obviously evolve and they become far more powerful than they were in the 1790s when Washington is addressing this issue. I'm wondering to what extent did the rise of these parties and their power contribute to the failure? Because I think we'd all agree. I believe there is a consensus amongst the panel here that we have failed throughout history, not always, but at various times, to limit the negative influence of faction. How have parties contributed to that?
Yeah, I kind of have a conceptual answer as well as maybe a historical point. It seems to me in the 70s when party control over its membership changed significantly. And this,
Right?
as
The
I,
1970s.
yeah, 1970. Sorry, fair enough. Touche. As I understand it, there were all kinds of rule changes that took place within the Democratic Party first. And the net effect has been, see, that people they're not beholden to the centralized party. They can run kind of independent from the party and in the fundraising. And so I think the more recent failures of parties have to do with the restructuring and the decentralization of party control over these individual members. So I think I'm going to lay some blame on the 1970s and the changes about how the parties would work. I'm going to lay it there. But I also think there's a conceptual problem that with this decentralization of control by the party and now allowing individual players or sub-factions, uber factions, clout in the media enhances that. I think our insistence on perfectionism plays a part in this. In other words, back in the day, maybe the party could say, "Sit down, Billy." Or, it was Billy because there weren't any Sallys in Congress. Sit down, Billy. Shut up. Go to the back row and be quiet and let the party leadership run the party. So I think um, now I think if people are voicing these factional ideas and they carry with them this idea of I need 100%, we've talked about this earlier. I need 100% of what I want because that's how I got to go play it at home for my base at home. So I think perfectionism, the insistence on perfectionism equals success, has contributed to this failure, and I blame the parties partially on that, but I also think it's like a conceptual fever that we have now in insisting that, look, go into Congress, beat each other up and argue and the baloney will come out, we're making sausage here. So you can't always get what you want. A great political philosopher there.
Okay, Mick.
Okay. So I think I would be more ugly towards political party failure than I would constitutional failure.
Well, you see, and it doesn't surprise me, or you seem to be, echoing Washington's distaste with democracy clubs in the 1790s to where with the democratization of parties in the 1970s.
Well, but yeah, a little bit. I think that's a fair point. But I also I do tend to side with Madison that they're inevitable, and we just need to figure out how to control them. And I'm saying political parties have not done a good job. I mean,
Well,
I
and
mean,
I might agree.
third parties in our history, they usually will survive one or two election cycles, and the major party brings them back in the tent. That's the history. Now that theory is being challenged right now. But yeah, I blame the parties as not controlling their club itself.
Mike,
No, I'll go to Chris first.
Chris?
I'm thinking of Sam Huntington. He described it as creedal passion.
Yeah,
I think that's a great term, and it kind of like you're talking about, Tim. And I call it purity, the purity
yeah,
test, right? So
perfectionism,
he
right?
called it the creedal passion, and he said that it's like this moralizing suspicion, right, of our political institutions. And he said it kind of goes in cycles, and we go through it periodically. And one of the things he talks about is the fact that there's this gap between what we think of our founding principles as liberty and equality are never fully realized, which also creates a gap between our institutions and our ideals.
Yeah.
So, and that speaks to the idea of distaste for certain things that people end up with, especially the opposition. But I love that term, creedal passion.
Yeah. I I don't know if I don't know what parties could have done to Tim's point, because to me, I see this as so deeply cultural and the parties responding. So I would say like beginning with the progressive era, going through the New Deal up through the civil rights period, there's this notion and examples of you have these elites, right? These gatekeepers in the media, in politics, in academia, and they're structuring the debate and they're saying these are the things we're going to do. It's going to be best, right? And things are moving along, and it's really like oh man, I'm forgetting his name. Help me, the Arizona Senator 64.
Goldwater.
Cold water.
I think Goldwater is to me, I have a meta theory that this has a lot to do with race relations and how United States is going to respond to establishing a liberal democracy. And Goldwater, I think, is the first to sort of like sh show like maybe the people need more say, right? It's that kind of idea. And then you have Watergate. I don't know what the Democratic Party or other parties can do to respond to this small d Democratic push. Like, why are you elites are getting things wrong? We want more of a say in electing who's going to be on the tickets. I mean, that's the primary stuff, right? And then right behind it, you have coming media stuff, and you have other kind of deregulation with the economy, and all of a sudden now it's like this kind of free for all, and that's where we're at right now, where it seems to be it's the governing philosophy right now. These gatekeepers and these folks don't know what they're doing, and they should be taken out as quickly as possible. That's the whole Doge, get rid of all the expertise and the bureaucracies kind of like thing. But I think it's coming from way back, and the what happens to political parties is one example of this small d democratic cultural shift that we're still living with through today. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, Professor Williams, what you think about the 60s and 70s when we get the democratic and the primary system. What
Yeah.
your assessment of that is, because although I think like a lot of things, it was well intentioned, that it contributes significantly to the
Huge.
problems that we faced in the 1990s onward to today.
Huge.
That because for a democratic primary system, small d democratic primary system, to be effective, it takes a level of understanding, insight, education amongst the people, which they don't possess. And so
Sure.
they're very susceptible, all right, to the passion and whims of the times and not to good governance. So, I mean, do you agree with me that the primary system, although well-intentioned, has backfired and caused much of the problems we face in our
Oh,
political system?
I mean, completely. I mean, to me, it's the first sort of gatekeeper to fall. And then you have the democratization of media where everyone's a citizen journalist. And then you have Citizens United, where now, I mean, I'm now stealing Chris's thunder because he's always mentioned this, right? Now you have not even like citizens from their communities choosing this stuff. You have these interest groups coming from outside with tons of money. I mean, right now, is threatening Elon Musk, right? Born and raised in South Africa, is threatening Republicans with primary challenges if they go against Trump's policies in Congress. That just is all like it's all part of the same stew of yeah, it good intentions but really bad unintended consequences.
So, Chris, let's run with that theme. I'm getting the sense that all of us on this panel would agree that Washington's fear has fully blossomed in the 21st century. That we have lost any ability to limit the power of faction and factional tyranny over our system. And I'm wondering to what extent Mike just mentioned Citizens United. Do you put the blame on money and on media versus structure of government?
Well, I would take one small exception to your question that we do have the power. We just don't have the political will. The power is there to push back on some of these things, but we just don't have the political will because, the members of Congress don't have, well, they're rather feckless right now.
Well,
Um,
remember, okay, I'll let you go because I have a problem with that.
well, I do with the feckless Congress. I absolutely have it, but
No,
they do.
to me, Congress is you say feckless, but Congress is responding to their constituents. Because if
Well,
We'll see. We'll see.
but my point is, David, you asked, is there power there? There is power. There's power within the government for the Congress to They could change Citizens United tomorrow if they wanted to. They could change McCutcheon, the follow-up case of Citizens United, tomorrow if they wanted to. They don't have the political will because they're not going to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, because they're not concerned about what's doing best for the American public. They're concerned about staying in power. That's why they don't want to be primaried by a guy like Elon Musk, because they're afraid. When you have people that testify in front of Congress that can't even admit that Russia invaded Ukraine, then they don't have the political will to do that. But yes, I would say the money's role in creating political factions is overwhelming. My goodness gracious, campaign financing, lobbying, wealthy donors, corporate interests, which absolutely puts us where we are today. Think about creating unequal power dynamics, super PACs, campaign financing, right? Partisan divisions based on money. The media, my goodness, echo chambers and filter bubbles, sensationalism and polarization, agenda setting and framing being the Mike mentioned gatekeepers. We see that the idea of fake news and misinformation, where now because of social media playing a role, you have an influx of misinformation coming from other nations that get amplified through the process. And then there's actually an intersection of money and media. Elon Musk owning X, right? And thinking about the messages it could put out there. So corporate media influence, political advertising. So yeah, I would say in a modern sense, absolutely the media and money and that intersection of media and money play a huge role in what's driven us kind of into the ditch, so to speak. But
Well,
I stay by my point. There is power there if we have people that are brave enough to use it.
well, let me ask you this. What is the ultimate trigger? All right. What's the ignition system of our constitutional republic? What's the first thing, or what's the ultimate thing that has to be working in order for the entire system to work?
Compromise. And,
Well, see, I'm gonna argue.
to not insist on a whole loaf. I mean, to Chris's point about what'd you call it? Ideological Huntington's phrase.
Credo passion.
Yeah, I think we've lost this ability to compromise and live with a half loaf.
Well, see, and again, I'm not going to disagree with that, but I see in a republic, in a system of representative government, what makes the representative, all right, who is going to be a flawed person, if we all agree with the fundamental view of mankind, what makes that representative act for the good is fear, fear of their constituents, fear that they will pay a price. And the fact of the matter is, and we look at what's happening today, all right, I live in one of the poorest counties with very high rates of people in poverty who rely on certain federal programs. All right. And we have a high number of federal employees to service those programs. And we are I'm in a community in which our two representatives are Republican, and those programs that serve the majority of the people are being cut left and right, and we are not hearing a peep. We are not hearing a word from our members of Congress. And why is that? Because neither one fears that they're going to lose office by acting the way they act, that they are pretty secure. So I say that the problem here is the people not doing their job. The politicians are going to get away with what they can get away with. But if they fear their constituents and they know they're going to be consequences for not acting in the good of their community, their district, then they're not going to do so.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit, David. I think that there's a fear of being primaried by Elon Musk because they're worried about losing it. They fear him, and they fear the president unleashing people on them more than they fear their constituents. And I don't think a politician should fear his or her constituents, because I don't think that's a healthy type of relationship between the people we elect and the people that do the electing. I think there should be an idea of, and I'm not talking, now I feel like I'm getting into Burkean kind of stuff about mirrored representation necessarily, but I think there should be a connection between a politician and his or her constituents. And I think we've lost some of that connection. So I think what we see and what you're describing, I certainly understand what you're describing, but I think that politicians don't act out of fear, right? And I don't think they should fear their constituents. I think they should be thinking about working for their constituents and not for just getting reelected.
Well, I mean, is healthy respect a modified acceptance? I mean, I can't help but think of Madison. He feared not getting into Congress if he didn't promise a Bill of Rights. You know, and the time he did the only election he lost because he didn't ply him with liquor. So now I don't know whether that's fear or healthy respect, deference to I don't know what the word is.
I'll compromise on that. I didn't mean fear as being in the corner, shaking and crying out for mama in the fetal position. I'm, so healthy
Yeah.
respect of the people. I don't believe that they have a healthy respect of the. I also don't think they're not worried about losing their job because they're in a safe district. Now, Mike, you were.
Well, that's what I mean. The students should be thinking about. I often tell my students this: the way that institutional rules and norms shape behavior. And so students like think about like you have one teacher where there's the class is all open discussion. Like how does that change the behavior in the class versus a teacher who is just going to have PowerPoints and refer the PowerPoints the whole time? Like I think it changes the behavior. And what Dave's getting at, there are about 25 to 30 seats every year amongst the 435 that are actually competitive seats. It's been in the interest of the parties to draw seats where they're not competitive because their goal is to get power. And this whole I don't know what the root it's hard we keep going down what the root is, but the way the incentive for politicians because of the districts they're in is not to go to Congress and pass a half-baked reform on the budget. What their constituents are saying is one or two things right now, right? If you come from a safe Democratic district, it's to go to Congress and say no to everything the Republicans say, because that's what they did to us during Obama and Biden, and we're going to do it back to them. If you're a Republican, it's okay. I'm going to go there and I'm going to tear down stuff and I'm going to take my cues from Trump and now Mr. Musk, and I'm not going to go against that. There's the institutional structure of the primary system, to your point, Dave, has set up behavior that's completely irrational under the rules and norms that we've set up. And we shouldn't expect the compromise to happen in that venue. We just shouldn't, because it's just not going to be.
It comes back to to us, the people.
Yes.
Because in the final analysis, a safe district, what does that mean? All right. In reality, it means to me a lazy district, a district of indifferent people, all right, who aren't well informed. The number of articles I've read in the last 24 hours about people who voted for Trump, who now have either lost their job or lost programs, kind of going, oh my gosh, and you want to scream. In fact, I'm enjoying their suffering. I'm laughing. That's how I'm going to get through the next 3.5 years, is I'm laughing at people suffering. It's like, how could you not know? Kind of stuff. And it's your fault because you chose to believe the hype and the bumper sticker rather than to do 10 minutes of homework and look into the issue.
Well, it takes you more than 10 minutes to read Project 2025. I can attest to that. I mean, had they read Project 2025, and I would not recommend it because it is 900 pages.
I was going to ask you how much of this is in there.
It's all in there. I mean, it's all in there. I mean, if you'd have read that, this is what you're going to get. And
right. And wouldn't you agree that there was enough journalism and media coverage of that document before the election?
In my estimation, this is my take on it. It was kind of like this bullet point phrase: "Don't elect them." Project 2025, 2025, 2025. Boogeyman is going to come out of the closet. Now, what is in it? There were a few statements that were made in my area, but not a lot of substantive discussion about what was in 2025.
Well, therein lies part of the issue, is the fact that where people get their information, and back to your question about media, David. So when people are in these confirmation bubbles, or actually one of my students years ago used this term, he called the stovepipe, and I really like that description, stovepipe, where you're just in this narrow frame of information. The people that now might be suffering in your district now, David, they weren't getting that information because their flow of information comes from a news source that doesn't talk about the negative sides of that.
they weren't getting it because they chose not to get it.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a conspiracy against them because there's such a
No,
proliferation
I'm
of
just
media.
saying because they're watching a certain their news feed is not going to give it to them because they're not going to go outside of that news feed.
We're too busy watching Survivor. Come on now.
And to bring it back for the students to
Dance
faction,
moms.
the the Heritage Foundation folks who wrote up Project 25 is a perfect example of a faction within the Republican Party. There are there are so many Republicans who are so in disagreement of our policy right now with Ukraine. Like they do not think it's the right thing for us to be supporting Russia through the UN or through the like they are so against that. But Project 20, it was in Project 2025 that this is what was going to happen. And now that faction is exercising power, and that group of Republicans who desperately want to vote against this, will see what they do. They might fear for their seat enough not to do it. But that is an example of a faction within a party, and then get that faction getting power.
I was thinking this discussion reminds me of an old episode from The Daily Show back when John Oliver was the correspondent. And he had gone to Australia to interview politicians. It was after one of our many school shootings, right? And so he's going to Australia because they had a shooting and they went after guns and did serious gun control. And he's speaking to an Australian politician who was from a conservative district, he's like a governor, what we would call a governor. And he said, "So what's your role of a politician?" And the gentleman said, "Well, I think I'm supposed to use my position to make it better for my people. And I think what's better for our people is that maybe we should do some type of gun control so we don't have these mass shootings. And if I don't get reelected, I don't get reelected, but I'm doing this because I think it's right." Then Oliver is going to interview, I think at the time, he's interviewing the chief of staff for Harry Reid, who was then in the Senate, the leader of the Senate. And he says, "So what's the goal of the American politician?" And he said, "The goal of the American politician is to get reelected." And they joked and stuff. And the guy goes, "Well, maybe I should rephrase that." And Oliver's going, "Oh, we'll edit that out. Don't worry." And of course, they don't edit it out. And it's interesting, and how many mass shootings have they had in Australia since? None. But we get thoughts and prayers, right? So it's like that becomes the goal of American politicians is to hold on to power, not to use power what they think is best for their constituents and let the chips fall where they may. Their goal is to hold on to power, whether that be a fear of their constituents or a no fear of their constituents or a fear of losing their seat. So I think that becomes a part of the issue where term limits, just going to throw that out there.
Well, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our hour and our discussion on Washington's fears there. So, per our tradition, let's provide students and teachers final thoughts, recommendations, insights into Unit 4, Question 2. Professor Williams?
Yeah. When I was looking at the bullet points, I think it's important when you're addressing this question, you're going to have a lot of great examples. I think it's important to think about this idea of will of the people that's in that bullet point. And you should think about, if you're going to say something about that, well, how do we know what the will of the people is? Is it a survey? I mean, in 2013, 75 to 80%, I forget the exact amount, totally supported this gun control bill in the Senate. And it failed to get past the filibuster. It failed to get 60 votes, right? So I think you need to think about how to about what the will of people means. How do you show that? The other thing you should think about is in the question, it's this idea of over time, how do we limit factions? And again, it'd be interesting for you to think about from like the 1820s onward. Are we most concerned about limiting factions, or are we most concerned about opening up space for more factions to do things? What are the examples of limiting factions? McCain-Feingold, maybe. Maybe the Pendleton Act, civil service. I don't know. I think it'd be interesting for you to think about what actually has been done to limit the factions other than the founding constitution, right? Because I think we live in a culture now where uh, we lean into the idea of allowing more activity and more speech rather than thinking through how do we actually limit it, the way that Madison was thinking about limiting factions. So that's my advice.
Professor Moore.
Well, I want to say this to the students. David has done a remarkable thing. I don't know whether you've noticed this, but I noticed this through this last hour. He asked the same question to Mike, and then he asked me the same question, but he changed one word. So my suggestion is to think about, do we blame the Constitution or do we blame political parties? Now, later in the segment, where David was prone to add a third component, like let's blame the people. My recommendation to students is camp out on political party failure. Look at why. Okay, so I'm going to give you why did the Federalist Party fail and fall apart? Why did the Whig Party? Yeah, okay, we're drinking game. Why did the Whig Party fail? Why did the Populist Party fail? Why is the Democratic Party failed? So I would do some case study on political party failure and their inability to hold people in the tent. And I really appreciated David's question, the same question, but totally different. Do we blame the Constitution or do we blame parties? So I'm urging students to really look at some party histories and why they fell apart and couldn't hold them into the tent. And I think that, and also maybe a kind of a side comment about, okay, when they fall apart, and we've got this political science thing called party realignment, critical elections. And so I'd look into those two things as well. And is there a connection there to the failure of parties to hold their factions in check and keep them in the tent, so to speak?
Professor Kavanaugh.
I agree with everything that Mike and Tim said. To kind of dovetail with what Tim was talking about, the first bullet actually asked you about constitutional as well as institutional. And I think political parties fall within that idea of institutional checks. And I think you would also be well to go with Dave's question to me, his first question to me about, yeah, this is a little Pollyannish to think that we didn't have this happening in the age of Washington, as much as I tried to find that tiny little hook, right? So understand that. But, and again, I say this a lot. So for the students, you're living through a time now that, we talk about division. We've had division within our nation. Division is not new in our history. But if you think this system is not working, I'm really excited to hear or possibly hear from folks how young people that are now just entering the process, how would you fix it? Right? If it's a constitutional issue, institutional issue, is it a party issue? Is it a fault of the people? And I think it's a big poop sandwich and everybody gets a bite, I think. But for the young folks, they're going to be given testimony on this as expert witnesses. One of the last things you want to offer are solutions. And I'm really hoping that you guys on the panel for this question have some really good solutions.
Well, I hope, since teachers, that you've enjoyed our root canal performed on the body politic and the constitutional system. The one thing, I guess, between now and when you are in Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C., is I think you're going to have, I'm hoping you're going to have a really good example, live streamed example of factional conflict within a party. And that is, we have a budget issue. And and it's real clear that there are multiple factions within the Republican Party, or there's at least two major factions on taxes and spending, on how they want to deal with this. And right now, the material I'm reading is a lot of unhappy people, all right, with this budget proposal. And I think that'll be a good illustration that you might want to follow along with to kind of use as evidence of factional battles within the political party system there. So in our next episode, we are going to be dealing with Unit 1, Question 2, which I guess the theme is freedom and liberty and expression, but you got kind of three major areas to deal with. So we're going to be talking about Voltaire, another Frenchman, I believe, or is he he's not French, is he? He's Swedish
He's
or something
French.
like that?
He's French.
Oh, he is French. Okay. So we got another Frenchman, Voltaire. Then we got to look into Anne Hutchinson. And then we got to look at the Stamp Act protest, which I mean, Professor Moore was there, so he'll have a lot to share with us on that event. So I'm looking forward to our next discussion. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye bye, bye bonds.